Okay, so yeah, welcome to the Political Studies Association Media and Politics Group online seminar series, and thank you for those of us joining us live, and those also watching on catch up later on YouTube. I hope you're all safe and well. Um, this is the 17th event in our seminar series, and we're delighted to welcome long-term delegate, friend of the MPG, Professor Stephen Cushion from Cardiff University, who's here discussing his new book, Beyond Mainstream Media, Alternative Media and the Future of Journalism. Stephen is a professor at Cardiff University, where he's also Director of Research Development and Environment at the Cardiff School of Journalism, Media and Culture, and he's on the school's senior management team, the staffing committee, and the 2029 RAF committee. He's published widely, including over 100 journal articles, book chapters, and research reports on issues related to news, politics, and journalism, and has written four solo authored books, including News and Politics, The Rise of Live and Interpretive Journalism, The Democratic Value of News, Why Public Service Media Matter, and what he'll be talking about today, Beyond the Mainstream Media, Alternative Media, which we'll be talking about. So in terms of today's presentation, for those attending one of our seminars for the first time, we try to keep it quite informal. So there'll be a kind of short presentation from Stephen to get us started, about 15 to 20 minutes. Then I'll ask him a few questions, but we'll hope to have about 20 to 25 minutes for audience questions at the end. You can either ask a question by turning your mic and camera on, raising your hand in Zoom, and I'll kind of come to you. But if you prefer to, by all means, please put your question in the chat box, and I'm happy to read it out. I'm going to shut up and pass over to Stephen to talk about his new book.
Thank you, James. Thank you for that nice introduction. It's nice to shamelessly plug the new book. Although it doesn't feel that new, because when you actually finish it and by the time the publisher gets round to actually sending all the proofs and so on, it actually feels like quite a long time ago. But I guess it is relatively new, a 2024 publication. Thanks for everyone for coming today. I'll give, as James said, a kind of headline kind of sense of what the book argues and some of the kind of key kind of headline data, if you like, and set up some of the debates for questions. So the book is a kind of culmination, if you like, of a 7-year project that kind of started around 2017. It's probably one of the largest studies of UK alternative media, right and left-wing media. And we can talk about how we define alternative media when we get into the debates. We focused on kind of alternative media that's self-identified as being alternative. We did a large content analysis of over 3,000 articles, over 17,000 social media posts over a 7-year period. And I can talk about the complexity around coding that material. It's a lot harder than the kind of conventional coding I've done with television news and press analysis. We carried out 40 interviews overall with editors and contributors, and I can talk about the access issues we had, particularly with it was easier, put it this way, with left-wing sites than it was more with right-wing sites, and getting people on the record and so on. Another challenge was actually looking at users of alternative media. So we got a recruitment company, Prolific, to kind of recruit people participating in a large survey about media use. And then we tried to target people that were kind of regular consumers of alternative media, which sounds easier than it actually is. And we tried to kind of granulate those particular users that were kind of daily or weekly users to get a real kind of informed sense of people that regularly engage with these sites. So all of that was designed to kind of come up with a kind of comprehensive picture of the output, production, and a kind of audience engagement. And the book kind of delivers all that, and it tries to engage with some of the latest scholarship around alternative media around the world as it goes through presenting this material. Let me move it on. Okay, so let me just set up the kind of context of when we started the project. At that particular time, 2017 to 2019, there was a lot of commentary about the growth and influence of alternative media at that particular time, which I'll talk more specifically about in a moment. But I think it was also to do with a reaction against the mainstream media, the MSM. At the beginning of the book, I quote the then director of the BBC saying that the mainstream media has become a kind of term of abuse. And in a speech that he gave, he talked about how people were kind of living in their own filter bubbles and echo chambers, which I'm sure a lot of us would challenge because the evidence doesn't necessarily support this. But this is very senior people working in the media industry alluding to this. And he didn't really explicitly name check alternative media sites, but he was hinting at that, the dangers of going outside professional journalism and seeking these alternative sources. But one of his colleagues, Nick Robinson, did a couple of years before that. This was after the 2017 election campaign, where, writing in The Guardian, he name-checked some specific sites like Wings Over Scotland, Westminster, The Canary, Squawk Box, Novara Media, and Evolve Politics, sites you may have heard of before, and was really quite openly critical, which is unusual for a journalist, because usually journalists don't openly attack rivals in that sense. But he was on the record writing for The Guardian, saying that the most liked and shared articles are about the mainstream media and the BBC in particular. They're shared by a certainty, fueled by living in a social media bubble, that we are reporters and presenters that are nakedly biased. So this is the kind of origins, if you like, back in 2017-18 that kind of prompted me to start to think about a project like the one that we undertook, and to ask questions like, does this accurately reflect how alternative media operate? Is it the aims of editors? Do alternative media users live in this, filter bubble? Are they, blinded by partisanship, that they don't go outside, these little bubbles? And it just felt like there was a lot of assertions going on with very little supporting evidence. And of course, it seems like a very long time ago now, but in that 2017 election, when of course we had Jeremy Corbyn as the Labour leader, then, surprised everyone by the fact that he took it very, very close. Obviously, the Conservatives won that snap election overall, but it was seen as particularly critical, the role of left-wing media in helping shape Corbyn's kind of campaign and get his voice across, because of a very hostile mainstream media environment. And it led to a lot of commentary. On the screen there, I've given you an example from BuzzFeed that was operating then, a very influential article by Jim Waterson that's talking about the rise of alt-left media, because he'd kind of done some investigations and found that a lot of this kind of sites like The Canary, Squawk Box, and Novara Media were producing articles that were more widely shared than a lot of legacy media. So this, of course, led to lots of commentary about how the mainstream media agenda was going to be, undermined, that there was power shifting, towards, alternative media, and it would change the dynamics and ecology of the media in the future. Of course, it didn't. But at that particular time, there was a lot of debate about that. I remember, it featured in, the Andrew Marr newspaper, on a Sunday morning headlines. I remember there being a Radio 4 Today show kind of commentary about this, that the media ecology was changing. We'd be looking at things very differently kind of halfway through the 21st century. And so all of this, back in 2017-18 led me to put together an ESRC project with Richard Thomas from Swansea University. And when we were lucky enough to get the grant, we recruited Declan McDowell Naylor, who many of you may know, who did some brilliant research throughout the 3-4 years we were on the project. And he was one that was leading a lot of the analysis of content, carried out all the interviews, with contributors and editors. And this was all kind of setting all this up at this particular time, that we managed to see this through over a period of 2 to 3 years. And the first thing that we kind of observed, if you like, even before we started to undertake the empirical analysis, was just the clear differences in all the sites that we looked at. And I've alluded to some of them already. It was clear there wasn't a kind of uniform pattern going on here. There were lots of roles and identities. And I think the first thing that struck me, because I hadn't undertaken this kind of research before, it was a departure from the usual stuff that I do, which is very much around impartiality, the BBC and broadcast, television media in particular. But in a lot of the commentary and the literature I'd read, that there was a lot of amateurism, if you like, poor production values, activism, blind activism that was kind of shaping the production of these sites. And it didn't really feel like that, just even superficially looking at these sites. I wish I could show you a clip that's on the YouTube channel here that was produced by The Canary. And they outline kind of 6 distinctive features about why they're different to the mainstream media, but also different to other alternative media sources. So it was a very confident editorial line and almost somewhat professionalism that was driving some of the decisions and the structure of some of these sites, which I thought was interested in going into it. And then, of course, we carried out this large-scale content analysis. And we did see, I mean, it's not a particularly brilliant graph, this, but you can see just quite quickly that across the different sites, right and left wing sites, some are driven more by kind of fact-based reporting, if you like. Some are based much more on opinions. There wasn't that kind of uniform coverage. And in the past, as I said, I've done a lot of content analysis of television news, and BBC compared to Channel 4, ITV, and Sky, and so on. And looking at that, there's a much more uniform way of presenting the news, if you like, and commentary. And you can still find differences, but they're more nuanced. Whereas with alternative media sites, it's much, there's much more complexity going on. Even in terms of partisanship, which is often the way that these sites are written about. There is a partisanship that's obviously there from right and left wing perspectives, but often it wasn't always in sync, if you like, with party political partisanship that we often see perhaps in the mainstream press. Throughout the early years of our analysis, particularly going into 2016 and 2017, a lot of the right-wing sites were very critical of the main right-wing party. That was primarily to do with Brexit and how that was being delivered, or debates about immigration and so on, that were different to how the online sites wanted policies pursued. And then we followed this up a few years later with some analysis of how left-wing sites in particular had changed in terms of their coverage of the main left-wing party. And that changed into 2021 when, of course, we had Keir Starmer as the leader of the Labour Party, and we saw a lot more critical coverage of Labour, and the focus, the agenda changed. And clearly that kind of political context was reshaping the type of output that was being pursued. But the one big thing that we found in terms of the kind of agenda that these sites were pursuing was around the mainstream media. As Nick Robinson, referred to in his piece, we quantified this. Overall, all the sites, it was something like a fifth of all coverage was about mainstream media, kind of critique of that. For some sites, I mean, phenomenal amount of coverage. Another Angry Voice, almost half of all its coverage was about the mainstream media, a phenomenal amount. And in the book as well, we kind of isolate this as well during the 2017 election. And there's a huge increase overall in terms of focusing on the media during that particular campaign. And then when we looked at that a little bit more specifically, we looked to see what type of mainstream media was being critiqued, what was being referenced. And above all, it was the BBC. Some of the left-wing sites were focusing much more on the right-wing press, but across left and right-wing sites, the BBC was the real kind of major object of attention. And to kind of look at that more qualitatively, we started to develop a little bit more close textual analysis to see how the BBC was being reported. Was it a kind of naked ideological attack on the BBC, or was it slightly more subtle and sophisticated in terms of its critique? And we did go into this, or I went into it with a somewhat open mind. But actually, looking at a lot of the articles, there were some, very critical accounts of the BBC that weren't particularly persuasive. But I'd say the vast majority were quite nuanced critiques of the BBC. Proper close surveillance, if you like, of some of the stories that produced, the production values, the editorial choices. They were drawing on particular academic evidence in some respects that were in some of the articles that were produced, drawing on official bodies, looking at things that weren't reported, and then looking at the evidence, say an opinion poll, looking at how certain mainstream media outlets had deliberately kind of obscured some of the facts and was bringing that into a wider context. So in the book, we develop this a lot more and look at the ways in which alternative media sites were providing, I'd say sometimes quite sophisticated accounts of the way that the mainstream media operate in ways that wouldn't be that distant from reading an academic journal and some of the critiques against the BBC. So overall, within that content analysis, we didn't find a kind of uniform pattern, a uniform style across all these sites, but it was quite complex in some areas, particularly within the kind of partisanship that was being pursued, but a shared kind of collective agenda around the mainstream media generally. In terms of the interviews with the producers of alternative media, mainly contributors, but also some editors too, again, the backdrop of this, going into the project, there was, a lot of amateurish kind of production values, political partisanship that was shaping some of the editorial choices. But again, looking and speaking to all the different people involved in this, we didn't really get that impression. A lot of the meetings were quite professional in some of the setups, whether it be, regular 9 o'clock meetings, an adherence to certain kind of processes, codes, standards. A lot of the sites at the time were signing up to Impress, an independent media regulator. And then when we quizzed them about that more, they were saying, no, we want our journalism to be independently assessed. We want it to be held to account. We want to legitimize it. We don't want people to take kind of cheap shots on what we're doing here. We actually want some of these standards, which again is in contrast to the popular caricature of some of these sites. And I should say as well, as I've mentioned professionalism quite a few times already. When we went into the interview, we didn't use that language. We weren't kind of prompting them to say things in order to elaborate on this argument, but it was quite revealing how a lot of these sites had really thought through processes and structures, and there were differences clearly in the amount of resources some of these sites had. Some of them, had a large multimedia team that were operating, but some of them was just a couple of people working with some legal advice on these sites. But they'd all kind of thought these things through. I won't read out some of the quotes that are on the screen there, but they just allude to the fact that they've got standards, there's processes there. In many ways, you could argue that they're not that different to how, a mainstream media newspaper would operate, with morning meetings, with selections about stories, decisions about which ones to pursue, how credible are the sources. These were things which very much overlap with mainstream media practices. And as I say, we weren't looking for them to say, use words like professionalism, but a lot of them did. They were looking to adhere to mainstream media standards, aspiring towards professionalization. And in the book, and we developed this argument a bit more in terms of specific instances of journalism. For example, social media is very critical to how these sites operate. And, the way that they were tweeting about certain issues and events in real time to pursue real time kind of policy shifts, for example, and trying to enter into that kind of political news cycle at the time to influence debates. They were really, really well aware of some of the algorithms that limit how far their reach is. And they were, these weren't just random tweets being sent out when it was convenient to them. They were really thinking things through to scrutinize and try and have maximize the impact that are there. And again, I mentioned this already about the kind of editorial line of some of the alternative media sites. The Canary in particular, really, in the interviews as well, developed quite a distinctive kind of market kind of brand, if you like, delivering kind of a tabloid left-wing kind of approach to journalism that would be perceived to be accessible to readers, which wouldn't be that akin to, say, the Sun newspaper, in a different kind of way. So that kind of surprised us really in terms of some of the responses that were there, and challenged that kind of lazy critique, if you like, and caricature of this kind of amateurish production values of alternative media. In terms of the audience research, this was probably the most difficult and challenging part of the research, just simply because it's very expensive, of course, to recruit people, to get people in. The survey that we did of nearly 3,000 people wasn't a representative survey. It was the some of you may have used it before, Prolific, a recruitment company that where we recruited a lot of people to participate in a kind of media survey, and then we asked them lots of questions about media consumption, one of which was around alternative media sites. And we just asked them, for example, if they'd heard of some of these sites that you're on the screen there, and whether or not they'd used them in the last week. So to some extent, you could argue that there's quite a large percentage, for Breitbart in particular, but also the Canary, that heard of the sites. But in terms of actual usage, it's actually quite low. But then actually, if you look at some of the media consumption surveys around mainstream media generally, apart from the broadcasters, in particular the BBC, which gets a huge amount of reach overall, if you look at some of the newspapers, the Daily Mail, the Independent, actually it's not that different to the kind of survey responses that you would routinely get, which, and I think this kind of is somewhat of a limit and a critique about, our approach. We couldn't really get into really kind of forensically going into people's routine uses of alternative media. The best study that I've kind of identified, which explore more in the book, is produced by Ipsos, where they looked at a much larger sample of people. They looked at personal devices. They tracked people more qualitatively, and actually a survey that was produced a couple of years ago just showed the full extent of Guido Fawkes, the Canary, Squawk Box, millions of page impressions just in the month of July. But also, the amount of minutes, Guido Fawkes getting 16 minutes per person within that. That's quite a large amount of time compared to many of the other sites. So I guess this led to a kind of a discussion in the book about the limitations of some of these surveys and how you can go about researching online media use. It perhaps needs to be slightly more nuanced. I mean, in the this data is reported from the Press Gazette. They also cite Guido Fawkes, which perhaps isn't the most independent source within this, but it's certainly a perspective that's worth listening to. He says that just relying on surveys is not enough because much of the readership is based in London. So if you weight it based on region, you're going to exclude a lot of the people that would regularly access Guido Fawkes. So I think this is more just a kind of critique about how we can really go about understanding alternative media audiences, the extent to which they are relying on some of these sources. So what we tried to do within that survey of just under 3,000 people is to try and identify regular users of alternative media. And we did that by kind of a methodology where we looked to see if they were kind of mainly daily or weekly readers of alternative media sites. And when they were, we kind of identified about 400, and then we invited them all back to participate again in the survey, and we got just over 300 overall that agreed to that. So we asked them lots of different questions. What the one I put on the screen here is just why they considered alternative media different to mainstream media, and you can see a wide range of responses around seeing news from a different perspective, offering views that you don't see regularly appearing in mainstream media, or the fact that you're listening to viewpoints that aren't funded by billionaires. So there are lots of what we consider to be quite thoughtful and pragmatic reasons for using alternative media. And, and a lot of this as well is not a kind of rejection, a wholesale rejection of mainstream media or isolating from it that kind of filter bubble characterization, but actually just using mainstream media, but that's also using other alternative media to get a kind of fuller sense, a more rounded picture of what's happening politically. And one of the things that we asked them about specifically was about their use of, or their perceptions of the BBC and their attitudes towards it. And again, what we did here, and this took quite a lot of time, as we did in the previous question I asked too, was we left it as an open-ended response, and then we analysed things qualitatively to kind of thematically get them together. So that took quite a lot of time. And then with the responses to the BBC, we had quite nuanced responses, particularly around the fact that the BBC is considered to be kind of biased in many ways. It doesn't have that kind of impartial perspective that it claims to often have, and the reasons for that. One person said that the BBC is not state-owned, but is operationally dependent on how the government sources it. How can they be impartial? Which again is not a critique; is a critique you would regularly see in academic journals or in academic seminars like this. But interestingly too, of about a fifth of all the responses around the BBC were actually quite positive. Which again challenges that myth of the filter bubbles, people kind of completely distant from mainstream media. But actually they were using it in addition to other sources. So what we kind of arrived at within the audience research is we kind of moved beyond this notion of the filter bubbles, and we actually kind of moved towards more of characterizing users that were considered to be quite media savvy, but quite skeptical users. As I said, they used the BBC and other broadcasters to inform and engage them, but they were looking at more critical approaches to the reporting of politics. And then when they did kind of justify and explain their source use, there were quite persuasive arguments about how journalism standards weren't being achieved at the BBC or other mainstream media. There was a sensationalism that impartiality couldn't be achieved because of the kind of political economy of the kind of media ecology. As I say, that I mentioned this before, it's the BBC that received most critical attention from audiences from right and left, but actually also on the left, there was a lot of critique around the right-wing press in particular. And I think, moving beyond the kind of UK-based findings, I think and this is what I generate an argument in the book around, is that the national media system in many ways shapes not just the editorial agenda of sites, but the kind of the user perceptions and engagement as well of alternative media. So perhaps some of the justifications and reasons for using alternative media use is different in the US, perhaps to many European countries, and in particular the UK. So that's a kind of quick sense of the headlines around the kind of content, the production study, and the audiences. But some of the broader conclusions I'll just quickly allude to, which I take up in the final chapter of the book, relate to kind of how we can categorize alternative media. If you're familiar with the literature, over the last 10 or 15 years or so, we've moved away from a kind of crude distinction between alternative media and mainstream media, and now it's kind of theorized on a kind of continuum. And I guess it's more a question of how long can that continuum exist. Fox News is a good example in the US. If you look at survey questions now, people would say, I think quite a considerable majority of people would say now that Fox News is considered to be a mainstream media broadcaster, whereas a decade or two ago, it was considered to be alternative. Where does Breitbart sit within that? If we think about the UK, where we think about GB News, where does that start to sit? Will that change over time? Is it becoming naturalized, legitimized? Or is there quite a lot of coverage, which there is around Ofcom and how they're dealing with it? And maybe the election will bring that out in the coming months. So that's quite an interesting thing to potentially discuss. I mean, one of the reasons why we began the project was because of the influence of left-wing sites, but across most countries, particularly in the Scandinavian countries, Northern European countries, it's right-wing sites which are considered to be much more influential, and certainly in the US. So, there's an interesting, and I talk about this right at the end of the book, why are right-wing sites more prominent? Is that to do with funding? Is it to do with the kind of political economy, the tone, the agenda of some of these sites? What can left-wing sites do to challenge some of that power and authority that the right-wing sites have? And then in terms of audiences, I've already mentioned this. I think, and I would critique the approach that we took too. I think we need much more creative, more innovative studies that start to isolate some of these users and try and understand user engagement much more. I think we made a good start in that, but I think that if we were to go back in time, it would be useful to be slightly more creative in the approach that we took. And then, putting all these things together, how can we assess the impact alternative media are having? What measures can we use there in terms of, the kind of influence that they have in terms of people's understanding of politics, their understanding of mainstream media too? Is it kind of eroding people's trust in mainstream media? Is it eroding, the particularly debates over the last few weeks around GB News? Is that starting to undermine what we consider to be impartial journalism in the UK and so on? So there's a lot more, I think, that we need to do to learn about how people engage and what kind of impact alternative media are having politically, but also across the media ecology. But I will leave it there. So there's lots of time for questions over the next half an hour or so.
Thank you, Stephen. I really appreciate that. And I'm going to offer a few thoughts now before we move on to audience questions. And if you have got any questions that you want me to ask, please put them into the chat, or when we get to the time, raise your hands and I'll come to you. I mean, I just wanted to offer some thoughts. Kind of when I went into reading the book to kind of prepare for today, I kind of went in with the context of the kind of like Nick Robinson, Tony Hall quotes, my stepdad in mind, conversations on Politics Live, the general consensus that we often see presented in some of the discussions in mainstream media are that these kinds of content publishers or news organizations are conspiratorial, can't be trusted, or lack professionalism. And what really struck me about the book is that it's quite optimistic. I think it's a really optimistic book in terms of the impact of these news organizations. I know you mentioned some of this in the presentation, but some of the key findings that these aren't just left-wing activists that are unreliable. They run conventional newsrooms that are virtual. These are news organizations that have quite sophisticated kind of like storytelling devices and operate in similar ways to mainstream media in some ways. So I was really struck by that kind of like positive that kind of positive message that came out of the book. One question I wanted to ask was, I mean, one of the key takeaways I took from chapter 2, but also the book more generally, was the interdependency between alternative media and mainstream news media that kind of goes across the book. And it made me think about the career trajectories of some of the staff from Guido Fawkes. So Harry Cole, who was at the Mail on Sunday and is now a political editor at the Sun, Alex Wickham, who was then moved to BuzzFeed and then moved to Politico, and then also Tom Harwood, who's now a presenter on GB News.
Yeah.
And the conclusion of that focuses on how and reflects on how left-wing, in particular left-wing alternative media, need to kind of reflect on their relationship to professional news media if they're going to, I suppose, impact more the public agenda. But I wondered also, did you find any evidence or do you have any thoughts about like influence in the other direction? So the extent to which these alternative media have influenced either the editorial strategies or the storytelling devices of professional news media?
No, that's a good question. There is, perhaps more so than a decade ago, much more overlap. So I mentioned that continuum between alternative media and mainstream media. And there's probably quite a good paper to be written about how journalists are moving in a much more fluid way in the way that you described. You described some quite high-profile journalists now moving freely, if you like, between alternative media sources and mainstream media sources, whether that be Politico and BuzzFeed or The Sun and Guido Fawkes. So I do think there's a lot more overlap there. So in a way, it suggests to me that there's the kind of conventions, if you like, which were of mainstream media, aren't as distinctive, if you like. What we're seeing is perhaps, there's obviously a different presentation, particularly in broadcast media from journalists, but I don't think it's as different as it perhaps was before. I think my point about the influence of, in the final part of the book, the influence of left-wing journalists and right-wing journalists is that it just feels like right-wing journalists. I mean, there's the research that's going on by a colleague of mine, Richard Thomas, who that's starting to look at this in terms of how often right-wing media actors are referenced in mainstream media compared to left-wing journalists and contributors across these alternative media sites. And they are far more in right-wing sites. It's quite, I don't want to give away his findings. I'm sure he can publish those in fullness of time, but it was quite striking what he said. I mean, he found this in the US, which perhaps is less striking, but he's found this in the UK. And I think it's more, I suppose the argument I was developing is more, if left-wing media continue just to have a hostile relationship to mainstream media, constantly criticizing it. And I'm a little bit critical of that towards the end of the book too, because I sometimes think you've got that constant surveillance, particularly at election time of mainstream media, and any kind of mistake, any slip that they immediately seize on, and then it becomes a kind of social media story, and then it becomes a bigger story that gets highlighted. And I just think that kind of decontextualization can undermine, what can generally be considered to be, good, impartial journalism. And we can critique that and get into a debate about that. But a lot of the time, it is an attempt to be as balanced as possible. And I think sometimes left-wing alternative media is so focused on that rather than perhaps other things that it's undermining its cause and its the influence that it can have.
That's a really interesting point, and maybe I can probably on something slightly related to that before we move on to audience questions. And that was, I suppose, I really liked how you tried to offer more nuance in terms of the differences between like UK-based alternative media. They're often lumped together, but as you said in the presentation in the book, there's massively divergent and different practices when you look across the sample that you looked at. And again, in terms of like professionalization and professionalism that you kind of observe in the presentation you look at in the book, I was struck. The example I'm most familiar with is probably Novara Media, and kind of seeing their trajectory over the last 10 years from like radio show to now, they have a daily live streamed podcast on YouTube, which goes out onto variety podcast platform straight after. It's very professional. I wondered if you could talk a little bit more about like the different, whether it's like editorial strategies or storytelling tactics, like the different levels of professionalism that you saw across the sample. Were there any differences in terms of like right and left wing, or were there particular differences that you observed in other categories between these different outlets?
Yeah, I mean it's a difficult one to comment on that because a lot of the research was quite quantitative,
Mm,
and I'm aware of particular stories where I think you could probably critique what I've said about the standards, and you could probably find quite a few instances of quite poor journalism or poor news reporting from both left and right wing sites. They didn't feature that prominently in our sample period, which over a 7-year period wasn't that huge. But as you know, it's very hard to analyze a large amount of content across 10, 12 sites.
mm,
So, I wouldn't want to paint a misleading picture. Do their standards, are their standards as high as, the fact checking and legal checks that go on at the BBC and ITV and Channel 4? Definitely not. I mean, but I think it was more a case of professionalism against some of the other, news outlets, newspaper outlets, online outlets. I think it's probably more akin to that. That's
mm,
different. But there was also, if we take the example of Impress, it was more there's a willingness and an aim, to be seen as legitimate within the news industry. There is an attempt there. They don't want to operate outside of that kind of authority, if you like, which is perhaps the caricature that's often, historically when people have researched alternative media, but also, in some of the attacks against alternative media, they never use that. They never refer to that and the fact that they want these external checks. And when there has been instances where they've perhaps been called out a little bit by Impress, that I think there's been an attempt to try and come up with something pragmatic. I remember speaking to Impress about trying to recommend certain editorial practices so that there was clearly on the page a difference between what's considered to be news and opinion. So it was
mm.
self-evident for the readers, rather than it being misleading and presenting fact as opinion. And I think that's just a good instance where that kind of professionalism is there. And I guess, to answer your question, so a bit more specifically, there was more evidence of that on the left. In fact, in terms of Impress, it was only on the left. It wasn't on the right. But I also alluded at the beginning, it was very hard to get people on the right to come and speak to us and be on the record as well. There's a kind of suspicion, I think, just generally within academia about, what are you doing? Why are you asking us these questions and so on? Which is a shame, because we were going into it in an open mind. And those that did speak to us on the record too, did actually, I think, were really helpful in terms of understanding some of the processes.
Thank you, Stephen. It's really interesting comments there. But I'll pass over now to the questions from the audience. And we've got a couple in the chat which I'll read out. But anyone else that wants to ask a question, if you raise your hand using Zoom, I can come to you after these questions. The first one from Jason. For the BBC, as it does tend to receive a lot of criticism of bias, are there any indications of what your participants meant by this? Do people just assume a left or right-wing bias, or did any of your participants hint at any other particular form of bias?
Yeah, that's a good question. If I might be able to get the actual responses up on the screen. There we go. So, I mean, that's, if we look at and we critique some of those, again, this is a kind of research question, if you like, content analysis coding question, where you get, these are open-ended responses. So sometimes people write several sentences. Sometimes people will write just a word or so on, and you've got to try and interpret that as best you can into different themes. So that's what you get with all these categories that are here. And we try and, sometimes they just get lumped together. So that first one, political bias lacks impartiality. Sometimes, that it's difficult to have been any more nuanced than that. But maybe the next one underneath it is a bit more nuanced. If there's a structure there, which I think probably a lot of us in the audience, including myself, would have sympathy with, in terms of if you're reliant on government funding, which is often tied to electoral cycles, it's very hard in many ways to operate without at least being somewhat sensitive to political debates, the political discussion at the time, and who will be the government of the day. And there might be, not for me to say, but there might be instances that are going on at the moment where that's evident too. So in terms of that, the kind of subtlety of the influence, it's not crude attacks on the BBC. It's not just saying that the BBC are all, left-wing loonies that work at this, particular public service broadcasting organization. There are instances and sometimes examples where they will cite, like they don't hold politicians to account, they don't fact check. There were instances, examples where they said, a government minister appeared on the Today Show or Andrew Marr at the time, and they were allowed to say something which wasn't challenged. And so in that sense, I think that's quite an informed response, in many ways, that says, and I think even the BBC at times, even Ofcom, has come out and said broadcasters should be bolder in terms of holding politicians to account, and that is consistent with being impartial too. And that's a lot of what we found within these responses, quite thoughtful and pragmatic, skeptical media users, as we described it, not just people living in a trapped in their ideological perspectives. Actually, people were wanting better quality journalism and giving good evidence-based responses.
Just to say, that's another one of the key findings which I really liked about the book, was that again the work you did on the audience to kind of demonstrate what they look like really pushes back against the lazy kind of cliches about these websites in popular discourse. Again, it's that idea of skeptical, media literate consumers was a really nice kind of intervention, I think. We had a question from Paul. Did you examine the position of formal industry training within alternative media?
We didn't kind of systematically, but it was kind of alluded to. And sometimes, if we were to go back, it would be quite good to have, of the 40 different contributors and editors, it would have been quite good to actually get their status and their history. So it's a shame that the question wasn't posed to me when we started the project, because we probably could have had that, and it would have been quite useful to have that there. I can give you my sense of it, my impression, which is that a lot of the contributors and the editors were former journalists as well, somewhat frustrated journalists that perhaps wanted to pursue a particular type of journalism, and they felt that it perhaps wasn't. And this is, I think, on both the right and left, but they just didn't think that they could operate in the way that they wanted to. And so, they took a different path, and, it might be Novara Media, or it might be Breitbart, and they were able to pursue it that way, in which again, which kind of answers the question in a way. So they probably did have some kind of formal training and some kind of awareness of how to operate independently and according to a set of processes and codes and structures. They weren't just producing content at 3 a.m. when they wanted to. These were 9 o'clock meetings. We decide things in a deliberative way. We then, look at the credibility of sources. What's the strongest piece here? They might even be somewhat market-based choices. What's going to trend well on social media? What's happening today at Westminster? Can we get that out? Will it get traction? If we get traction there, can we, so it wasn't just, I wouldn't say they were just purely market, commercial reasons, but I think it was a kind of an editorial choice that was informed by what could be newsworthy. And these are, again, fairly akin to decisions that are routinely made by mainstream media journalists.
Cheers, Stephen. The next question we've got is from Tom. Thanks, Stephen, for what promises to be a valuable and important study. Did you discover in the course of your research whether parts of the success of some alt media platforms is due to their willingness to cover newsworthy issues that, for ideological, practical, or other reasons, the mainstream media do not cover? If so, what are some of these issues? I've heard scholars and journalists talk about, for example, the reluctance in the mainstream media to cover Julian Assange's travails or certain foreign conflicts, Israel-Palestine, up until very recently, due to pressure from the state through denotices and the like.
Yeah, I can't think of any specific examples off the top of my head, but this survey here, I think, gives you the best kind of evidence that I have about that. That they wanted. I mean, the first response there isn't that particularly helpful. Alternative perspectives, but yeah, what they were craving there was underreported issues or tougher, more in-depth reporting, producing news that, as I said, as the question alluded to, wasn't really being covered from mainstream media for whatever reason. Maybe there's a sense of, legal risk. Maybe it's that kind of informal political self-censorship that they don't necessarily want to pursue things because of that, risk of reputational risk or a risk of being undermined and criticized by politicians. So there's all sorts, I think, of possible things, possible reasons behind some of those choices. But I think the survey data there perhaps gives you the best sense of why people were turning to alternative media.
Cheers, Steve. Actually, we've got a hand raised from Alex. If you're happy, should we come to you, Alex, for your question?
Yeah, brilliant. Thanks, Stephen, for the talk. Really, really interesting. My question really is, you were mentioning about the right-wing alternative media possibly being more powerful and having more impact. And I was just wondering whether you asked any questions or looked into funding and who was funding different media and whether that was having an impact.
Yeah. We would have liked to have asked that question a lot more, but as I say, if you read through the interview or the two chapters that were based on kind of interviews, you'll find most of the quotes are brackets left-wing contributor or left-wing editor rather than right-wing. So we didn't really get a huge amount of perspectives from that kind of right-wing, from right-wing sites. So we couldn't really, to be honest with you, even if we had, trying to get them to talk about finance and funding would have been very challenging because of the suspicion that was driving this project already. And I don't want to give, this is being recorded, so I'm not going to say too much more than that, but I think you can get the sense of what I'm saying. Because there's a murky world of funding out there that probably requires a much more strategic, systematic approach than we were able to do within that project. They do it in the final chapter. I talk about the US media environment, and I'd refer to some studies that have gone about looking at the influence of funding that's gone on in the US and how that's really challenged mainstream media. So, unless I think it's as we often do, if we look to the US and see some of the trends that are going on there, I do fear that level of funding and to an extent I referred to a couple of times already, we can see this a little bit with GB News, can't we? And how that's operating. I'd still say at the moment it's operating on somewhat of the margins, but I don't actually see it kind of at the moment kind of going away, as in quite a lot of sites that we examined back in 2015, 16, 17, 18 haven't kind of continued to be influential. They've kind of waned a bit in influence. Whereas I do think GB News is a good example of actually it's starting to gain more traction, particularly online. And I think over a certain period of time, it will gradually become normalized and naturalized and become part of the media ecology. And there's live debates that are going on at the moment, as I'm sure you're aware of, about how Ofcom are dealing with this. And so to answer the question, I think that will become more influential, that kind of level of funding, as billionaires see the potential political influence that they can have and the disruption and the ability to undermine mainstream media in the future.
Brilliant, thank you.
Cheers, Alex. There's a question from Paul in the chat. Did you analyse the demographics of alternative media users? From their responses, they seem to be switched on, highly media literate.
Yeah, I mean, I don't have them off the top of my head, but yeah, it's in the book. I think without wanting to undermine my own study, it's not representative. It's a picture. Is it generally slightly, I think it was slightly more younger and educated, somewhat educated, not like kind of PhD, but university educated to a degree that are using it. So yeah, I would probably share the question's kind of skepticism in a way that it's not particular, CDE, socio-economic groups that are consuming this. It tends to be slightly more literate, perhaps educated people that are turning to some of these sites.
Cheers, Stephen. We've got another question in the chat from Natalie Ann. Thank you for your fantastic work. I'd be interested to know if you included RT in the media you looked at. RT is, of course, banned now in Europe, was growing in popularity at the time of your fieldwork. RT brands itself as alternative, objective, hard-hitting, and appeals to the savvy media consumer on both the left and right, but in fact use the branding to peddle propaganda and disinformation and sow division in the West. It's worth noting that many people seek to construct themselves as savvy media consumers, but this may not always reflect the reality of their media use.
Well, there's a good point at the end we can come back to, but yeah, no, we didn't include RT. It's very of its time. At that particular time in 2017-18, as we were kind of getting into the project, there were a set of very specific UK sites that were featured in BuzzFeed and featured during that election that we felt that we really had to include, and we didn't really, the kind of state, if you like, state operationalized kind of sites and broadcasters as well with RT. We just thought it didn't really fit with that kind of sample that we were generating. It was quite UK focused in that way, but I would agree. I think RT and other sites like that are, becoming increasingly influential. And I think for a slightly different study, they should be included in those kind of samples of alternative media. Again, it'd be interesting to see how alternative that is, obviously, because it might be seen as alternative in the UK, maybe, but would it not be alternative in Russia? And, so how we interpret that could be interesting. In terms of how users position themselves as being savvy or not, I would agree with that too, because, we are kind of analysing thoughtful, educated responses here that will self-construct and legitimize certain things. So again, we have to be quite critical in terms of how we interpret some of these responses and how we can draw conclusions about their media use. Taking everything at face value, I would agree, I think would be a bit naive.
Cheers, Stephen. Have we got any final questions? Because we've got 5 more minutes left before we finish. There's no more questions. Oh, Emily, we'll come to you next.
Hi, Emily. Been a long time since I've chatted to you.
Oh. Hello, sorry, trying to get my video started.
Yes.
Thanks, Stephen. Really looking forward to reading the book. I've got loads of questions, but I'll confine myself to one, which feels like a kind of ending question in terms of the future of alternative media in the UK. So you've already kind of alluded to the fact that when you were starting the project, it was kind of having a moment in UK politics. And I'm wondering to some extent whether that moment for some of the sites that you've used is slightly over. I'm thinking particularly the kind of left-wing ones who are particularly reliant on social media getting a lot of their kind of their outputs out there, and obviously with the changes to various social media platforms of late, whether that will still be kind of happening. So I just wondered about whether you could kind of say a bit more about what you think the future is for the UK sites in particular. Thank you.
Thanks, Emily. Yeah, no, I would agree. I think, the honest answer as well is as soon as you finish, you know what it's like, you finish one project, you move on to the next. And I'm trying to finish off. I was lucky enough to get both an ESRC and AHRC project at the same time, and I finished this one first, and now I'm trying to write up the findings of a disinformation project. So I kind of moved on and haven't followed the journey, if you like, the trajectory of some of these sites. But yeah, some of them have. Navarra has continued to thrive, but that was very different in many ways to some of the other sites. Evolve Politics, for example, that's pretty much diminished. Westminster was of its time, very focused on Brexit. And the funding dried up because of that as well. So I don't think it even exists anymore. If it does, it's very limited in terms of what it does. I suppose the most interesting thing, and I've already mentioned it, is I think the role of GB News, perhaps News UK, and these other sites, if more will emerge, because they again self-identify as being alternative to the mainstream. But yet you've got mainstream politicians appearing on it, and you've got a mainstream, official state body, if you like, or it operates independently of the state, of course, Ofcom, giving it a license and saying it operates within the impartiality framework. And of course, that's up against attention at the moment because sometimes they're being called out for that, but sometimes they're not as well. And so they're testing and pushing the boundaries, if you like. They would kind of concede that, they would acknowledge that themselves about is it okay as we approach the election for the same political party to have, acting MPs interviewing, chancellors and other things? Is that considered to be legitimate journalism? Within Ofcom's rules, it says that there's got to be alternative perspectives that are feature within part of particular news items. Now, the debates at the moment, and if you look at lots of the Ofcom reviews into some of these impartiality infringements or not, is the degree to what's being allowed. And GB News are being advised by former very senior editors of broadcasters about what potentially they can get away with. So I think this is tied up in a way with alternative media and alternative journalism, because it's almost pushing the boundaries, if you like, of alternative media that's always operated on the margins online. Well, first of all, pre-online, it was very marginal because they didn't have the production costs to deliver lots of print copies that could be distributed. Of course, online, they could do that far better. And then in that social media period where it wasn't the environment we're currently in, that it could be shared a lot more easily as it was in 2017, and you could get impact immediately. Now it's obviously mitigated quite a lot more. And now we're getting it potentially on a broadcaster and pushing, as I said, the boundaries of what is alternative or not. And I think how that plays out actually could be really significant. If it is considered to be legitimate, and a lot of these things rules are changed, maybe the BBC is held to a different standard than others. There's now talk about BBC News Online being regulated, or it will be regulated online, but that's just the BBC. Will other sites get that too? Will that be will GB News have to operate that way? There's a lot changing, I think, in regulatory ways, which will then fashion a new form of alternative media in the future. As I said before, with funding, if rich billionaires that want to influence politics see the success of GB News, then they're going to have more and more channels that operate in that market, I think, and not just directly, influence people, if you like, turning onto their channel, but actually directly or indirectly undermining the rest of journalism by questioning it and questioning its authority. Where this comes over several years, you're going to start to erode people's trust, or a lot of people's trust, in what's considered to be impartial news, like we get on the BBC.
Thank you, Stephen. And we're at 2 o'clock, so we'll wrap up now. And just to say a huge thank you to Stephen for volunteering your time to come and talk to us today. We really appreciate it. I hope you're all safe and well, and keep an eye out on the Eventbrite for future events. And take care, and hopefully see you all soon.
Thanks, everyone.